Up to this point, everything we had done lived in theory, design, and internal conviction. The architecture made sense, the separations were clean, education realigned thinking, execution logic enforced discipline, guidance preserved momentum. On paper, it worked. But there's a difference between a system that makes sense and a system that survives contact with the real world. This is where most well-intentioned ideas fail. Not because they're wrong, but because they can't withstand being used by people who weren't part of their creation. Once expertise leaves the room it was formed in, it gets stressed in ways you can't fully anticipate. People push on the edges, they skip steps, they misunderstand intent, they apply things out of order. If the system can't absorb that pressure without breaking, then the expertise was never truly portable. That was the risk we were staring at when Compound began to take shape. From the beginning, we were clear about what Compound was not meant to be. It wasn't a shortcut to outcomes. It wasn't a replacement for advisory work. And it wasn't an attempt to turn complex planning into something universally accessible by stripping away nuance. Compound existed for a narrower, more disciplined purpose, to let our thinking travel further than we physically could, without losing the constraints that made it effective in the first place. That distinction drove every decision. The temptation, especially when building something public, is to be generous, to offer more options, more strategies, more flexibility. It feels empowering, but in practice, that kind of generosity is often the fastest way to recreate the very confusion that made the work inaccessible to begin with. So instead of asking how much we could include, we asked what we had to protect. The answer was sequencing. In real planning conversations, we don't start with strategies. We start by ruling things out. We establish context. We determine what happens now versus later. We eliminate attractive ideas that would break something downstream. That process rarely feels like advice in the moment. It feels like restraint. Compound had to replicate that restraint. What emerged wasn't a platform that handed people answers. It was a system that narrowed the field deliberately. Questions were asked in a specific order, not because the order was elegant, but because changing the order changed the outcome. Strategies were surfaced only after others had been eliminated. Certain paths were made inaccessible entirely, not because they were bad ideas in isolation, but because they were wrong in context. This is where making expertise portable gets uncomfortable. People don't like being told, not yet. They don't like being prevented from acting ideas they find compelling. And software, especially, is expected to be accommodating. But accommodation without consequences is just abdication. If the system allowed people to move freely without discipline, it would hollow out the thinking almost immediately. So Compound slowed people down. It forced them to understand before acting, to model before deciding, to see not just what a strategy could produce, but what it displaced. In that sense, it behaved less like a tool and more like a principled advisor who refuses to let enthusiasm outrun correctness. And then something interesting happened. The questions changed. Instead of what should I do, people started asking, why does this apply here, but not there? Instead of chasing outcomes, they started interrogating assumptions. The system wasn't just distributing knowledge, it was shaping how people thought. That's the moment we knew the architecture was holding. But it also revealed the next tension. Compound worked because it was disciplined. But discipline alone isn't enough when people are navigating complexity for the first time. Even with education and execution logic in place, uncertainty still surfaced, not as confusion, but as orientation questions. Am I interpreting this correctly? What am I missing? How does this connect to that? In a traditional model, those questions route back to an advisor. In our model, they couldn't, not if we wanted the system to scale beyond us. That's where guidance became non-negotiable. The guidance layer wasn't designed to answer questions in the way humans do. It wasn't there to make decisions or override logic. Its role was narrower and more subtle, to preserve continuity of understanding, to reconnect ideas people had already encountered, to surface context they might have forgotten, to point them back to the right part of the system when they drifted. In other words, it existed to prevent people from misusing the system without reintroducing dependency on human judgment. That balance was delicate. Too permissive, and the guidance layer would become an oracle. Too restrictive, and it would be useless. It had to behave the way we behave when someone is almost seeing the problem correctly. Not correcting them outright, but nudging their attention to what matters. When that layer came together, Compound stopped feeling like a product and started feeling like an environment. A place where thinking unfolded in a controlled way, rather than a collection of features. And this is the part that surprised us. Making expertise portable didn't make the work simpler. it made it more explicit. It forced us to articulate why certain things were constrained, why others were sequenced, and why some ideas were excluded entirely. In doing so, it actually sharpened the thinking itself. But as compounds stabilized externally, something became impossible to ignore internally. The same dependencies we are eliminating for the public still existed inside the firm. Our team still escalated edge cases, still relied on memory, still depended on a few people to clarify intent. The architecture was working, but only on one side of the wall. That's when it became clear that making expertise portable externally wasn't enough. If the thinking was going to live outside of us, it had to live inside the firm in the same structured way. That realization didn't undermine Compound. It completed it. In the next episode, I want to move inside the firm and show why QHub became inevitable, not as a productivity tool, but as institutional memory, and why internal scale is actually harder than public scale once judgment is the product.